Hi everyone. We'll just give a couple minutes for other people to join, and then we'll kick off. So just 1 minute, and then we'll start. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the recent publication of Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. The report is titled Driving Destruction, Cattle Rustling and Instability in Nigeria. So today we'll have a discussion about the report, and we have the authors with us who are going to be presenting the key findings, and also a broader discussion on cattle rustling in Nigeria, especially on its multifaceted relationship with instability. And we have two speakers joining us to focus on the impact of cattle rustling on peace building in Plateau State and on responses and lessons learned to mitigate the impacts of cattle rustling. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm your host for this launch. I am Flore Berger, analyst in the West Africa Observatory of Illicit Economies, an observatory that is part of Global Initiative. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping rules. So we have 4 speakers today who will be speaking for 10 minutes each. And then we will open the discussion with a Q&A. So throughout the webinar, you can use the Q&A section that you should see at the bottom of your screen, and use that section to ask any questions, and I'll direct them to the speakers when we open for the discussion after about 40 minutes. Also, just so that everyone knows, the webinar is being recorded, and we will use the comment box to share some links so that you can, for example, go and have a look at the report and other resources that we will share throughout the webinar. I'll hand over now to Lucia Bird, the director of the West Africa Observatory of Illicit Economies, for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Flore, and good morning, everyone. And I'd like to reiterate Flore's thanks on behalf of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime for joining us today for this really important discussion. Here at the West Africa Observatory, we have been focusing our work, our research, our programming on the intersection between illicit economies, conflict, and instability. This is not a new discussion, but repeatedly it continues to be oversimplified and based on the assumption that all illicit economies drive instability in similar ways. And the very different illicit economies that we see across the West Africa region are often elided, blurred together in the type of impacts that they are perceived to have. Not only is this incorrect, but it's a dangerous assumption because it really risks undermining responses, whether they are implemented primarily from a stabilization perspective or from a criminal justice and law enforcement perspective. So our research program is really seeking to shed further light on this intersection and really pull out the wide range of distinct impacts that illicit economies have on stability in the region. From our ongoing research, research on this intersection, cattle rustling has really stood out as an illicit economy that plays a very central role in driving instability, not only in Nigeria, but across the region through a range of ways, through financing armed groups as part of armed group governance strategies, and in exacerbating existing tensions and driving retaliatory attacks, which lead to ever-swelling conflict. In short, it's extremely important to understand cattle rustling as an illicit economy and how it intersects with instability. And this research that we are very excited to launch today is a step in that direction to try and bring greater understanding to this criminal economy that has received far too little focus to date. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to an exciting discussion. Back to you, Flo.
Thank you very much, Lucia. So just a few opening words. So as Lucia said, cattle rustling is often in the region having devastating impacts, but is underlooked. So in Nigeria, for example, it has evolved from a sustainable community practice into a significant illicit economy, delivering material profits for the conflict actors, but also having impact on communities and multiplying arms. Since 2011, the country has experienced a surge in the number of rustling incidents, resulting in thousands of deaths, loss of livelihoods, widespread destruction, and displacement of people. Cattle rustling deserves more attention because it is among these illicit economies most clearly driving instability in Nigeria, more so than other that we traditionally focus on, such as armed robbery or drug trafficking. So in this webinar, we want to explore the evolving dynamics of cattle rustling in Nigeria, and especially its multifaceted relationship with instability. And to do so, we have a fantastic panel today. We have first Kingsley Madueke and Lawan Danjuma Adamu, who are the authors of the report, the recently published report on cattle rustling in Nigeria. So Kingsley is the Nigeria Research Coordinator at Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. His research centers on communal violence, instability, organized crime, terrorism, and peace building. He's also a lecturer at the Center for Conflict Management and Peace Studies at the University of Jos in Nigeria. And he has a PhD in political science from the University of Amsterdam. Lawan, he's the Nigeria Field Coordinator at Global Initiative, and he's also the co-founder of the investigative journalist platform Dateline Nigeria. And before joining us, he was an editor at the Daily Trust, a Nigerian newspaper. So the two authors, Kingsley and Lawan, are joined by two speakers for this webinar that we're really happy to hear from. The first one is Manji Danjuma Mongrock. He's the team lead monitoring and evaluation at Plateau Peace Building Agency. He has worked in the past 8 years for a range of humanitarian relief projects. He has obtained a master's in peace and conflict studies from the University of Jos, and he's currently pursuing a PhD in the same university in gender and women studies. And then lastly, we'll hear from Nengak Daniel Gondi. He's a project officer at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. He holds a master's in international migration and ethnic relations from Malmö University. And his research centers around conflict, migration and displacement, identity, and belonging. So this is our fantastic panel for today, and we'll start with Kingsley and Lawan, who are going to present the key findings of the report, Driving Disruption, Cattle Rustling, and Instability in Nigeria. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Kingsley.
Thank you very much, Flo, and thank you everyone for joining us. Good morning. In this presentation, what we'll try to do is very straightforward. We will explore the evolving dynamics of cattle rustling and its implications for instability in Nigeria. And like Flo mentioned in her introductory remarks, cattle rustling deserves particular attention because more than other illicit economies that have received a lot of focus, such as armed robbery, drug trafficking, cattle rustling has been at the center of driving instability in Nigeria, and not just in Nigeria, but if you look at it regionally, even in countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, cattle rustling has been a major source of instability. But we know also that the relationship between cattle rustling and instability is multifaceted. Not only has this phenomenon been the cause of thousands of deaths and large-scale displacement of communities, it also remains a major source of financing for conflict actors and contributes significantly to multiplying armed militias and harms, especially on local communities. The presentation draws on our recently published report entitled Driving Destruction, Cattle Rustling and Instability in Nigeria, to discuss the key findings that stand out, their implications for our understanding of the intersection between cattle rustling and instability, and how these findings can inform policy and responses. Next slide, please. But you want to ask, but why cattle rustling? Why look at cattle rustling in the first place? And the motivation for looking at cattle rustling is because of, it came from our research, a research project that the GI-TOC actually undertook. And just to give a background on this research, it's one of GI-TOC West Africa Observatory's flagship projects. And this project mapped the regional illicit markets in 15 ECOWAS member states, plus Cameroon, Central African Republic, and the Chad. The aim of the exercise is to identify the key illicit hubs across the region and then explore the degree to which each of them fuels conflict and instability. For the second step, we developed a quantitative metric called the Illicit Economies and Instability Monitor, which used quantitative data together with expert analysis to score hubs into one of 4 bands, from low to very high. Now, the monitor assesses the level of connection between crime and instability, not just a high level of crime or a high level of instability. The emphasis is on where the nexus is. So high or very high means that there's a high nexus between illicit economies in that hub and conflict and instability. As can be seen in the graph, cattle rustling emerged as one of the 3 illicit markets, alongside arms trafficking and kidnapping for ransom, which appeared far more commonly in hubs, where illicit economies were identified to play a significant role as vectors of instability. In other words, one of the clear findings that came out strongly in this project was cattle rustling appeared more frequently in areas where illicit economies play a pivotal role in contributing to violence and instability and conflict. So, we also know that if you look at the example of central Nigeria, for example, in places like Plateau State and Benue State, in fact, the entire Benue Valley region. If you look at it, we also see that there's a strong intersection between cattle rustling and communal conflicts and tensions, a subject that I'll come back to later. Next slide, please. So just a few lines on methodology. In terms of methodology, the research employed a mixed method approach. We combined qualitative and quantitative data. The fieldwork involved about 80 interviews and at least 8 focus group discussions across 8 local government areas in Zamfara, Plateau, Kwara, and Oyo states. Further, of course, we did a lot of key informant engagements, follow-up roundtables, and then well-targeted follow-up interviews. Next slide, please. So I'm sorry. Okay, just to start, I'll start with by looking at the evolution of cattle rustling. And I'm just basically going to look at national trends before we now zoom in on particular cases. So we'll start by focusing on the evolution of cattle rustling, which I've mentioned. Our research actually identifies 3 phases in the evolution of cattle rustling in Nigeria. Each of these phases has defining characteristics. So the first phase of cattle rustling involves cattle rustling as a sustainable practice, enjoying a degree of cultural legitimacy among Fulani pastoralist groups and communities. The main purpose of cattle rustling in this phase is to replenish depleted cattle. It typically involves stealing a relatively small number of cattle heads and did not involve large-scale lethal violence or the damage or large-scale damage of livelihoods. The second phase, which we can roughly put between 2011 and 2018, in contrast to the first phase, this second phase involves armed groups, sophisticated weapons, and theft of hundreds and in some cases even thousands of cattle heads at a time. It involved large-scale lethal violence and extensive destruction of property and livelihoods. The third phase of cattle rustling, which covers from 2018 to date, it's characterized by a southward diffusion of cattle rustling. So for example, since around 2018, there has been an increasing southward geographic diffusion of cattle rustling and associated with violence, spreading towards Niger, Benue, Kogi states, and penetrating the southwest through Kwara and Oyo states. Next slide, please. The second thing to look at after looking at the evolution of cattle rustling is the actors and supply chains. So the actors within the supply chains can be divided into 3 broad categories. We have the cattle rustlers, middlemen and intermediaries, and then thirdly, the buyers. The first set of actors in the supply chain are the groups and networks directly involved in cattle theft, including ethnic militias, self-defense groups, jihadists, armed bandits, and opportunistic criminal networks. Cattle rustling offers a crucial channel for financing for these armed groups, especially for the procurement of arms, and then, of course, sustaining the loyalty of gang members. We have seen this particularly come out strongly in the Northwest. The second set of actors are the middlemen and the intermediaries who facilitate the sales of stolen cattle and the transporters who move the stolen cattle to markets, sometimes over very significant distances. These intermediaries also include road union workers, security agents who man checkpoints on highways, and cattle market officials who conduct spot checks at markets. Market officials and security agents are bribed either in advance or on the spot to turn a blind eye to stolen cattle. The amount given as bribes differs, of course, greatly according to a cattle dealer. Sometimes, quote, sometimes it is as little as 10,000 naira, which translates roughly into 23 euro, but other times it can be as high as 100,000 naira. That is about roughly 230 pounds, rather, unquote. The final set of actors that deserve attention are the local and international buyers. Local buyers of stolen cattle are cattle dealers located in different parts of the country. While some rustle cattle are sold at markets close to the point of theft, many are moved to other states. Cattle rustled in the north, for example, are predominantly transported and sold in the south, where they have higher market value. Next slide, please. So now I'll just briefly look at the interlink between cattle rustling and other illicit economies. So cattle rustling is strongly linked to and serves as a precursor to other illicit economies in Nigeria, particularly arms trafficking and kidnapping for ransom. The GI-TOC illicit hub mapping initiative, which I referred to earlier, launched in September 2022, identifies 10 illicit hubs that feature cattle rustling, arms trafficking, and kidnapping for ransom as major markets. Cattle rustling plays a prominent role in swelling the proliferation of arms. In both Zamfara and Plateau, for example, actors involved in cattle rustling procure arms to steal cattle, perpetrating violence and engendering insecurity in the process. Further, in response to the growing threat of cattle rustling and the associated violence, self-defense groups have emerged to defend communities and, along with residents, stockpile arms. This has contributed, of course, to multiplying the number of actors buying weapons, swelling demand, and creating a huge arms trafficking market across the country. Now, the arms market plays a particularly pivotal role in foiling violence in Nigeria. For example, the Organized Crime Index 2021 ranks Nigeria's arms smuggling market far higher than the average of West Africa, scoring 8 in contrast to the regional average, which is 5.5. Cattle rustling is also linked to kidnapping for ransom because the actors involved in cattle rustling have typically resorted to kidnapping when cattle rustling proves less lucrative. For example, in Zamfara, a decline in incidents of cattle rustling amid depleting cattle stock and falling cattle prices has coincided with a sharp increase in incidents of kidnapping. Next slide, please. Lawan, are you there?
Thank you very much, Kingsley. While we have focused so far on nationwide trends and the overarching structure of the cattle rustling economy, there are important regional variations in market dynamics. And in particular, the degree of violence changes significantly between regions, as does the trajectory of the development of the cattle rustling economy, with each region involving its own set of actors and dynamics. A key objective of the research leading to the report that we are launching today is to underscore these regional differences, to underline the need for understanding the prevailing contextual factors in each case, and hence the importance of context-specific responses. Next slide, please. Let's start with Zamfara. This is the epicenter of cattle rustling in the Northwest. Cattle rustling has fueled large-scale destruction in Zamfara. For example, more than 200,000 cattle herds and about 162,000 other livestock were stolen between 2011 and 2019. Within this period, about 6,319 people were killed and 3,672 people were kidnapped. Further, cattle rustling has contributed to a major rift between Hausa and Fulani communities in Zamfara, leading to pockets of intergroup confrontations in some areas. There are two important points to understand about current context of cattle rustling and instability in Zamfara. The first point is that Zamfara has a strong presence of different armed groups, including armed bandits, jihadists, Ensake vigilantes, and Ensake vigilantes. Yeah. A second important point about the dynamics of cattle rustling in Zamfara is that it is part of a repertoire of financing options and governance strategies engaged by these groups. Though cattle rustling remains a source of financing for armed bandits, the depletion of cattle herds in northern Nigeria since 2009 have driven them to increasingly explore alternative economies, especially kidnapping for ransom, as well as taxing and levying farmers or even taking over farmland from local communities. However, the recent incident in Katsina, a neighboring state to Zamfara, where clashes related to cattle rustling led to more than 80 deaths, is a strong indication that cattle rustling remains a major source of instability in the region. Next slide, please. Now let's turn to Plateau State. The prevailing contextual factors and current dynamics of cattle rustling in Plateau State are distinct from those in Zamfara. In Plateau State, cattle rustling is implicated in the dynamics of long-standing conflicts between predominantly Christian local farming communities and mainly Muslim pastoralist herders. Further, across southern and northern Plateau, cattle rustling incidents in rural areas perpetrated by ethnic militias are shaped by and to a degree reflect intermittent violent conflicts between indigenes and settlers in urban jaws. Ethnic militias on both sides raid cattle herds both as a means of finance, the procurement of both as a means of finance both as a means to finance the procurement of arms, and since 2021, as a part of scorched earth tactics. A Fulani leader, for instance, in Barikiladi, which is one of the areas in Plateau State most affected by cattle rustling and violence, explained, quote, he said, there are two reasons for cattle rustling in Barikiladi. The first is that these groups sell stolen cattle to buy arms to continue fighting. The second reason is not to sell, but to kill the cattle. They just want to make sure that they harm the cattle owners economically, end quote. Scorched earth policies are deployed by both Fulani and Birom communities. A resident of a farming community in Barkil Ladi described how herders frequently destroy their farms. In contrast to Zamfara, where there is a strong presence of several armed groups, including armed bandits, jihadists, and Ensake, there are two broad categories of actors involved in cattle rustling in Plateau State and other parts of north-central Nigeria, namely ethnic militias and opportunistic criminal gangs. Further, in Plateau State, there are no instances of imposing zakat or levies on cattle herds or farmers. Next slide, please. Although cattle rustling is more prevalent in northern Nigeria, as explained, there has been an increase in southward diffusion of cattle rustling since around 2017 and 2018. One of the main reasons for the southward spread of cattle rustling is the overall dwindling cattle stock in northern Nigeria. This is due in part to rustling itself, but also to the effects of climate change and more specifically, desertification. Most analysis of cattle rustling have focused on the northwest and north central regions, which have a longer history of cattle rustling without paying adequate attention to its southward spatial diffusion. Furthermore, these have failed to capture the second-tier impact of cattle rustling. Since 2018, the Southwest has experienced a surge of violence between Yoruba farmers and Fulani pastoralists. A key risk factor linked to the emergence of large-scale cattle rustling in the Northwest and North Central regions. Reports fanned by sensationalist media coverage of deadly attacks allegedly perpetrated in northern Nigeria by so-called Fulani herdsmen are widespread, contributing to deepening intergroup suspicion and distrust towards Fulani cattle herders. Secondly, the supply chain of stolen cattle extends southwards and over borders, particularly as regional price differences draw a significant proportion of cattle rustled in the north to markets in the south. These southern states that share boundaries with the north central region act as a transit point for stolen cattle being transported southwards. For example, Oyo is a major transit point for cattle coming from Kaduna and Zamfara through Kogi and Kwara. From Oyo, cattle are distributed to markets in Ogun, Lagos states, and in Ogun and Legon states with above average beef consumption. As indicated in the slide, cattle have higher price value in cattle market in the south than those in the north. This difference in price has made the South a major destination for stolen cattle from other parts of the country. Finally, the movement of IDPs forcibly relocated southwards, it's exerting pressure on resources and can potentially fuel competition and ethnic tensions. Further, cattle rustling has partially contributed to the emergence of Amotekun, a state-sponsored, ethnically homogeneous militia that risks being instrumentalized against particular groups. Next slide, please.
Now we look at just a highlight of some of the responses that have been implemented against cattle rustling. So we have federal government responses, we have state level responses, and then we also have community level responses. So state responses to cattle rustling fall into two broad categories. We have military approaches, which include crackdowns, arrest, prosecution, and non-military approaches, including dialogues, peace agreements, and then what the Nigerian government calls amnesties. The Nigerian government has implemented a range of law enforcement and military responses. One of them, of course, is the Operation Thunder Strike, which was designed to curb instability connected to cattle rustling, predominantly in the Northwest. While often effective, these securitized measures usually disrupt armed bandits in the short term. But the order restored is usually very brief, as armed bandits are very quick to regroup and even perpetrate more daring acts on communities. We have seen this happen in Kaduna, we have seen it happen in Zamfara and even Katsina. At the subnational level, states across the Northwest have employed a series of bans and prohibitions that target cattle rustling with a range of outcomes. The Zamfara state government, for example, shut down 12 cattle markets in December 2018 and 4 others in August 2021 before reopening some of them, I think in November 2021 and then in January 2022. But many residents that we spoke with feel that such measures have not addressed the problem of cattle rustling in any meaningful way. In fact, in some cases, it's been counterproductive, plunging communities into hardship. Some state governments have explored non-confrontational approaches. For example, in 2019, Zamfara, neighboring Katsina, and Sokoto states offered amnesty to armed bandits. However, the amnesty and ceasefire collapsed only 2 months later when an armed group attacked a security post and killed 9 soldiers in Anka, LGA, following clashes, of course, between farmers and pastoralists. In the North Central region, Plateau and Benue states have taken some steps towards addressing both cattle rustling and violence between farmers and herders. I'm happy to say on Plateau State, we'll hear from the Plateau Peace Building Agency. I'm sure they will expatiate more on what the government has done against cattle rustling. But just to mention that, for example, in 2013, the Plateau State government established a committee against cattle rustling. Unfortunately, the committee has not been active since 2015, when there was a change in government from PDP to APC. At the community level, responses are mainly in the form of mobilizing self-help groups, vigilantes, and neighborhood watch groups. These groups play a pivotal role in local security, but they are usually outgunned by the heavily armed bandits, jihadists, and ethnic militia groups who are usually equipped with automatic weapons. Next slide, please. Having looked at some of these responses, and we'll be happy to discuss further in the Q&A session, but I'll just jump and touch on some of the recommendations that have emerged from this research. So central to a more effective response to cattle rustling is granting it the appropriate degree of priority in allocating resources. That's the first point. Cattle rustling must be recognized as central to armed group financing and conflict dynamics in both Nigeria and the West African sub-region more broadly. It is an illicit economy which does not enjoy legitimacy among communities and which intersects with communal tensions to drive violence. Consequently, addressing it is extremely crucial. More specifically, first, there's a need to consolidate and harmonize ongoing state interventions. Cooperation and synergy between the various security agencies are essential in this respect. Second, there should be a framework to regulate vigilante groups and other self-help groups that are emerging across the country. Our government should establish a viable institutional framework for regulating both state-initiated and community vigilantes, such as the Community Protection Guards in Zamfara. Third, there's a pressing need to couple securitized approaches with development-focused responses. For example, we know that there's a need to address the humanitarian dimension of cattle rustling and instability. Particular attention should be paid to the welfare needs of IDPs by providing safe shelter, food and sanitation, as well as basic amenities such as water, electricity, and healthcare. Now, not tackling this humanitarian dimension increase the vulnerability of affected communities and increases the possibility of these communities becoming integrated into armed groups. Finally, government and other stakeholders should develop and implement interventions that target the whole supply chains of cattle rustling. So now the experience has been, the main focus has been on the cattle rustlers, the people that engage in cattle rustling directly in terms of the ethnic militias, the criminal gangs, the armed bandits, the jihadists. There are a lot of other entry points. So this means complementing ongoing law enforcement and military interventions with approaches that target a range of entry points in the cattle rustling supply chains. Besides the perpetrators, it is important to engage with other links in the supply chain, including the transporters, the middlemen, and of course, the buyers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kingsley. And thank you also to Lawan for sharing a bit with us the key finding of your reports. And as I said, I think, yeah, the link has been posted on the comments. So for the participants, you can go have a look and have a read at this really good report if you want to know a bit more about it. So we'll now be hearing from Manji Danjuma-Manrock, who's gonna tell us more on the impact of cattle rustling on peace building in Plateau State. So Manji, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Flo. Good morning, everyone. I am Manji Manrock from Plateau State Peace Building Agency. I'm going to talk briefly on the impact of cattle rustling on peace building in Plateau State. The context of Plateau State generally is quite significant, as reiterated by the two previous speakers. There's a slight difference between what's happening in Zamfara and what's happening also in Plateau State. For Plateau State, we've noticed that over time there are so many dynamics due to the long-standing violent conflict, basically from 2001 till date, and that has metamorphosed into a lot of criminal activities. Ordinary subsistence or livelihood crime into organized crime, and sometimes it has the coloration of political power tussles and also organized violence, and this cannot be checked under one straitjacket conflict engagement. However, that has brought a lot of negative consequences within the state. I just want to, next slide, please, so that then we talk briefly about what the Plateau State Peace Building Agency has been engaged in. Basically, Plateau State Peace Building Agency was established 2nd February 2016 to look at issues of violent conflict and also try to see how it can create sustainable peace among diverse ethnic and religious groups that make up the state, looking at how to coordinate issues of conflict, how to dialogue with parties in conflict, create also collaborative partnership with wide range of stakeholders. Basically, that's the mission and also the mandate of the agencies. Next slide, please. Part of what I'm also going to talk about based on the context of Plateau State, I want to briefly talk about the observation and also the trends of some of the things we've noticed within the state over time. The involvement of the farmers and herders in violent conflict attracted a lot of issues regarding cattle rustling. Sometimes within the state, you find out that farmers are basically attracted by high quality manure, on farm cattle roads, so sometimes you notice along Barking Ladi, Riom, and other places, you find that those grazing reserve routes that the farmers normally, the pastoralists normally route themselves, you find that the cattle dunks normally, when it drops, the place becomes very fertile, so the farmers get attracted to some of those places. With time, you find out that farmers start migrating to some of those places, and they expand their farmlands, and they block some of the cattle routes, and definitely it breeds some of this violent conflict between the farmers and the herders. Also, you can also understand that part of what we have noticed within the state is due to the violence in communities within the state. Some of the pastoralists have moved to terms as safe havens, and also some of the herders also, they have been displaced in some of their communities, have also moved to other places, thereby increasing issues of pressure on land and also social amenities, and thereby you find out that due to blockage of cattle routes and other indicators, like you find out urbanization and also increasing population, a lot of those places that normally have not been grazed upon, buildings have been erected over time, and that has brought about, affected the relationship of farmers over time between basically the indigenous and also the settlers. And also talking about indigenous settler issue, there have been claims of relationship by, in quote, owners of the land, and also which are basically the indigenous tribes, and also most herders, pastoralists, or transhumans who are temporarily settled in some of those lands. Also, they demand, there are this perceived notion that they demand equal rights. So sometimes in trying to figure out how to resolve some of these issues, they engage in some of this violence. Now, talking about some of these narratives that bring about violent conflict in the state results in a lot of mishaps and also aggravated anger between basically the farmers and the herders in those communities. You will notice that there's a trend, that the farmers, are aggrieved due to farm encroachment, and also they now probably retaliate by killing some of the cows. They now retaliate by injuring some of the cows. Sometimes, they retaliate also by rustling some of the cows. And sometimes also the farmers try to also retaliate by rustling back, to also create tension in some of these places. So with that little background, you find out that a lot of violence, pockets of violence have been happening within certain communities. And also cattle rustle is easily transmitted into cash. due to the poor economic situation within the state, you find that basically the youths between the ages of 16 and between the ages of 16 and I think based on our last check, up to 48, have been involved in rustling to just meet ends meet, because some people that are some perpetrators that were caught, also confessed to that basically they're trying to just fend for themselves and find a source of livelihood. Also, you can notice that most cattle, that within this within the breeds within this place are different from the breeds that are outside the country. So sometimes the nature of the breeds that are transhumans, we notice that they normally don't rustle, cattle of transhumans that are coming from outside the country. They mostly rustle the cows that are within the country because of the peculiarity of the breed. When you rustle certain cattle that are outside Nigeria, it's easily traceable. So basically, we notice that most rustle cattle are within the vicinity of the indigenes or the settlers within the state, so for easy transportation from north or from Plateau State into the south. And also we notice that most of these cattle rustlers are familiar with the terrain. And most of the times you notice that they have insiders that give them heads up of how the pattern of some of these cattle should be rustled. You find that some of them have been herding before. And one of the things we try to disassociate ourselves with is within the state, also your own investigation, you find out that a lot of indigenous or autochthonous people from Barkinla, the Riyom, the northern zone, and also the southern zone, Lantang, North Lantang South, had herds of cattle. These are indigenous of the Ross, has to do with people that live within that surrounding, that are familiar with the terrain of the place, and thereby getting the people involved probably also involved in some part of reprisal attacks. We find that over time, when two parties are in conflict and they try to get at each other, sometimes they rustle each other's cattle to see how they can also aggravate anger. They can also try to also attack the other party financially, economically, to also break the person down. And also, like the two speakers have said, it's also a source of financing for them, because when they rustle those cattle and they sell them, they try to acquire weapons and other things that can support them. And also, part of the thing we've noticed is also neglect. Part of the thing we notice is it's also neglect of farmers and the needs of farmers, and also the needs of herders. This is very, very important, because within the state you find that there will be a high budgetary provision for budget for the year, and you find out that a little has been done, most especially within the veterinary institution, within the issues of taking care of the cattle within the state, and also provision that has to do with the grazing reserves, all the social amenities that can confine the herder within a safe space. So sometimes we find out all these factors, tend to also promote some of these activities. Next slide, please.
Manji, just sorry, excuse me to interrupt you. Can we try and wrap up so we have enough time for the Q&A, please? Thank you.
Okay. So basically, for us, part of what we've noticed as an impact is the killing of people when this cattle rustling occurs. Also, violent conflict resulting to death between farmers and herders. That has happened a lot in Basa local government. And also we saw that it has affected the relationship between the farmers and the herders a lot. And also large scale of displacement. Using Basa as an example, you find that due to the conflict between the Iroquois and the Fulani, due to some of these cattle rustling and other indices of conflict, we've noticed that there's no Fulani that lives in Iroquois land for more than 15 years. Due to the intervention of the Plateau State Peace Building Agency, we've had about 2 years engagement of dialogue, and sometimes last year, around June, they were able to sign a peace pact to see how we can have a safe return of displaced people within the community. And there's a high rate of mutual suspicion when issues of cattle rustling happens within some of these communities. Also, tension and intolerance between ethnic groups, basically, which has to do with the herding community and also the farming community. There is a lot of tension, aggravation, and also perceived notion of intolerance between them. And proliferation of illicit drugs, small arms and light weapons. Due to the proliferation of some of these illicit weapons and also drugs, we find out that conflict has increased within the state. You notice that there's a boundary between Basa and Kaduna, and because of the locally manufactured weapons in Kaduna, there's an inflow of weapons, locally manufactured weapons into Basa. And also you can notice from the southern zone, from Taraba, there's also an inflow into Langtan North and Langtan South. So that also has also aggravated some of these issues of cattle rustling in some of these places. Next slide, please. Now, what are some of the things we recommend? We try to see how we can create a consultative framework between these pastoralists and farmers is very, very important. And part of the thing that the Plateau State Peace Building has done is to see how it can create local structures to respond to some of these issues. We try to see how can we bring the farmers and the herders together to live in peace. How can we create a symbiotic relationship for them to respond to some of these issues of cattle rustling and also other social vices within their community. So we created what is called Community Peace Architecture Forum as a response mechanism for some of these issues. So they meet monthly to discuss patterns of threats to peace within their communities, which involve cattle rustling and also maiming and killing of some of those cattle and encroachment into farmlands, which is one of the basic things that aggravates some of these indices of cattle rustling. Also, we try to see how we can advise the revamping and also of some of these grazing reserves. Like we have one of the biggest grazing reserves in Wasi, which we're trying to see, is it possible, can it be revamped? And when the issue was also ranching came on board, the Plateau State Peace Building Agency was very, very involved. And we try to see how we can create a no harm zone, that's do no harm, to see where those places that will be picked up, by government will not further aggravate some of this conflict. One of the things we try to do is just to see how we can curb, the excesses of some of these cattle rustling. If we can provide them in a safe place, if we can put them in the place that they can have access to water, veterinary facilities, it can be in a safe place and also provide security for them. So we'll reduce this part of cattle rustling in the state. And also we try to see how we can create also civil military relationship for early warning and early response. Because we notice that there is a little breach of relationship between the security agencies and the community people. Sometimes when they get information, they hoard some of those information, they don't relate it to the security agencies, and thereby also aggravate some of the cattle rustling pattern within those communities. So we try to see how we can create a symbiotic relationship between them to see how they can also curtail the excesses of this cattle rustling within the state. So apart from that, also we try to see how we can also reduce the inflow of small arms and light weapons through our sister agents, Operation Rainbow, which are also working with the Hunters Group, the vigilante groups, and Neighborhood Watch. We try to see how they can respond to some of these indices of cattle rustlings, of early warning and threats to conflict when it's being reported in real time. So these are some of the things that we have tried to do as a response to some of these things that has affected the state within Plateau State since the agency was created. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manji. And so now our last speaker, we'll hear from Nengak Daniel Gondi on lessons for Nigeria. I see, the slide is on, so you can speak.
Yeah, thank you, Flo, and thank you, Manji, and the two previous speakers. My name is Nengak Daniel Gondi. I'm a project officer at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue here in Abuja. But please, I'd like to state that the opinion I'm going to present does not represent the opinion of my employer or any other institution I'm affiliated with. So next slide, please. Okay, so before we look at a few recommendations, I wanted to make a couple of observations about the problem of cattle rustling in Nigeria. And I think it is not just a crime, not just in quotes. It is not similar with the incidents of loss of property to armed robbers, which also happens a lot, kidnapping or loss of property to internet fraudsters. This is because of the linkage between owning cattle and a sense of identity and belonging. There is often also the erroneous belief that cattle rustling is perpetrated by outsiders. So like in the case of Plateau, for example, when cattle is lost, you hear people blaming members of one tribe or the other for the loss of cattle. But it is becoming very clear that cattle cannot easily be rustled without the active collaboration and participation of persons who are experienced in herding cattle. So it could often be some sort of insider jobs. Related to that is the fact that decades of cattle rustling has ended up dispossessing previous cattle herders of cattle. So we now have a pool of persons who are experienced cattle herders, but they no longer have cattle. So that, you see, is creating a pool of possibly willing soldiers in cattle rustling. Now, despite the heavy dominance of Fulani ethnic group in cattle herding in Nigeria, the value chain of cattle herding in Nigeria, it has equities from across Nigeria and even beyond. Then I pose a question, why is it that cattle rustling always generate an armed response? And this is very different from the response you see when other kinds of crimes or losses of livelihood occur. Next, please. Okay, so I think Kingsley and Lawan did a very good job, and they also provided for us like phases within which the problem of cattle rustling can be discussed. But I think to add to that is the context. It's not just time bound, but I think cattle rustling occurs within the spectrum of criminal banditry, where armed groups attack a community and they take off with anything of value they can find. So in this scenario, cattle rustling often occurs alongside kidnapping for ransom, destruction of farmland, and also destruction of community. There is also the case of cattle rustling occurring within the confines of communal conflict. So where ethnic groups clash, and then one ethnic group or perpetrators of the violence end up with cattle as spoils of conflict. I think that a lot has come up in Plateau and also in Benue State. Then Kingsley and Lawan also drew attention to the small-scale rustling, which occurs what I would call internal rustling, instances where one rustler tries to replenish their stock from the stock of their neighbors. But I think that in addition to all of these observations, there is need to clearly buttress these phases with more evidence and data. Next. Okay, now I try to reflect on the relationship between cattle rustling and instability. First, I think that cattle rustling, it drives violence because a lot of violence is often used in the taking of the cattle. We've had instances in the Northwest where entire communities have been razed down just for a few tens or hundreds of cattle, which is ultimately the item that the perpetrators of violence make away with. But it's also the case that cattle rustling also inspires reprisal violence. And so when cattle is taken, the community, the herders return. For example, Benue State, in particular, Agatu is an area where massive violence has been linked to previous episodes of cattle rustling. Then I think it's also not easy to separate cattle rustling from other forms of criminality, such as communal conflict, kidnapping for ransom, and armed robbery. So I think that more often these are interlinked, and it would be better to discuss them as a group of crimes than to attempt a surgical divorce between the forms of crimes. Then I think also that while cattle stock is depleting in the Northwest, the epicenter might move southwards. And it might also change in the sense that it won't only be cattle that is taken. So if the attackers attack a community that no longer has cattle, it's possible that anything can be taken. And particularly at risk is human beings who could become victims of kidnapping for ransom. Yeah, so reprisal violence linked to cattle rustling, it creates a self-perpetuating cycle of violence because one incident of violence inspires a reprisal, and then eventually that reprisal inspires another episode of conflict, and so a self-perpetuating cycle. So there is often very little justice to the problem of cattle rustling, and one opinion is the fact that the victims, being nomadic, they are always on the move, and so sometimes they will just take the losses and proceed with whatever is left. They are also not educated, and especially when they move to areas where they don't speak the dominant language, they might not be able to call for assistance and access the institutions. Government policies in some states aim at limiting open grazing. They create barricades which keeps herders in some locations, and they are unable to move on to the next location. And then they are in that fixed spot, they are very vulnerable to activities of herders, of cattle rustlers. Then Manji also made a linkage to the National Livestock Transformation Plan, a policy of the federal government aimed at promoting ranching, not just ranching, but the production of fodder and supplying veterinary services and everything that herders will need in one spot. This is aimed at keeping the herders in situ. I think this is a very brilliant policy, but it needs to be rolled out very fast so that it can demonstrate replicable results. Next, please. Okay, so let's try to look for solutions. I think I will propose a four-pronged approach involving the academia, the government, communities, and the private sector. I think there is a lot that these stakeholders can do. First, I think there is need for more research. Thank you, GI-TOC, Kinsley, and Lawan for this, but I think there needs to be more. The impact of ethnic grievances on cattle rustling, the linkages between jihadis and cattle rustlers, relationship between cattle rustling and other forms of crimes need to be better investigated. I've heard a lot saying that cattle rustling feeds organized crime, but so far I think there is very little evidence for that. I think there is a distinction between the arms that criminals need for the purpose of cattle rustling versus the arms that others are using to perpetrate violence and destabilize communities. What is the linkage or otherwise between these two? There is also the need to unmask the beneficial ownership of cattle, because it's very easy to assume that these cattle belong to a small herding family, but very often we're hearing that the herders you see are only trustees of some powerful persons who ultimately own the cattle. There is also the need to try to unmask with evidence who is the ultimate beneficiary of rustle cattle. We've had instances of agreement between communities and bandit groups. We would need to know more if they really work, if they are sustainable, what is the community giving up to sustain that kind of agreement, and does it ultimately promote safety of persons and livestock? On the part of the government, I think there is need to increase investment in animal herding to discourage long distance pastoralism. NLTP needs to be supported, but in addition, we would also need to see the clustering of herders into cooperatives so that they can more easily access capital, take up ranching and growing further in the same place. Then I think there is the missing link of justice. We need to see efforts being done first in community dialogue, which will promote cohesion between herders and farmers, but also in the criminal justice system, which will ensure that justice is done for incidents of cattle rustling, but also ADR, particularly one that focuses on traditional institutions, religious institutions, and so on. The community, particularly herder community, need to show moral leadership. Community leaders need to speak up against instances of marginalization of the herder communities, because increasingly we're hearing bandits take up this rhetoric of being marginalized as an excuse for doing what they are doing. But this may not be the view of the whole of the Fulani ethnic group. So we will need to see more moral leadership on the part of community leaders. And for millennia, farmers and herders have coexisted peacefully. And that is not in the absence of clashes, but that there have been institutions and mechanisms for addressing grievances. I think we will need to resurrect these systems of managing conflicts between farmers and herders, and so that we can see more stability. Finally, there is a lot of, for the private sector, I think there is a lot of opportunities in the herding. If well managed, it can be a very profitable area of business. In fact, one can say that herding is too serious a business to be left only in the hands of the herders. So we will need to see models that are not only driven by the government or communities, but are actually commercial models that are put to work in promoting animal production. For example, the National Livestock Transformation Plan, as a model, it just seeks to promote ranching. Can this be done on a commercial scale, particularly dairy companies, meat companies, and so on, can find value in sourcing their own cattle and growing a herd within easy access. Then we also need to consider more investments in other areas of agriculture. Small ruminants, goats and sheep, and also plant production could also be strengthened. Then a challenge I think that is presently existing is the difficulty in separating rustle cattle versus legitimate cattle within the value chain. And this is very difficult, especially with stock that is often sold hundreds of kilometers from where they are originally sourced. But I think there are models in other areas of business which we can adapt in the agri sector to promote a system of ascertaining ownership of cattle, and to ensure that when cattle is rustled, it does not easily find a market. Over and thank you.
Thank you very much, Ngak. And yeah, I wanted to say that all the presentations really also included quite a big part on the responses and, you know, what can be done to mitigate the impacts. And I think that's really important because sometimes we learn a lot about a topic, but we're just left with not much, you know, looking forward and you know, a bit of hope for the future. So thank you to all the 4 speakers for talking about that. So we have about 15 minutes now for the Q&A. And so I'm gonna kind of put some of the questions together because they do work quite well together. So the first question, we had 2 questions on climate change. So one is about the relationship between cattle rustling and region experiencing more climate change. Do we see there that there's, you know, what is the relationship there? And another similar question on climate change, but more looking forward. So Sarah McVitie is asking to hear more on how future climate change might further impact on cattle rustling. So that's one question on the climate change. Then another kind of thematic we had a few questions on is related to cows and breeds. So there was a question about if some of, you know, white cows are coming from the Sahel and are prohibited, like it's not allowed to sell them in the markets. And related to that, we had another question on how can rustle cattle can be identified, especially in locations that are far away from where they were initially rustled. And are there ways of asserting ownership in the markets? So that's on the breeds and, you know, where the cows come from and if it's possible to identify them. And then the last question is on responses, because we talked about it a lot already in the presentations, but there are more questions on that, which relate to other strategies by the local communities to help curb cattle rustling, and also a broader question on how securitization can be coupled with development in mitigating harms from cattle rustling. So maybe for the climate change question, we can first hear from Manji, and then if the other speakers want to jump in very quickly, please feel free to do so. On the breed and identifying cows and breeds, we can hear Lawan and Ngak, and then we'll hear from Kingsley on the securitization and development as a response. Please keep your answers short because we have 12 minutes, so straight to the point and not too long. Let's start with climate change and Manji, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Flo. For climate change, the intensity of competition over natural resources has created a lot of damage, basically for us here in Plateau State, because of the migration due to issues of flooding, issues of water lack, disease, and also famine. You know, that has made people migrated unprecedentedly in large scale, you know, migrating down here to the middle belt, and that also poses a lot of threat because you have competition over natural resources is getting high, competition over social amenities is increasing, drastically, and also the pressure on the economy, has increased a lot. So, competition, and also, very funny enough, you can even competition over livelihood and source of social and economic activities, has also increased. You find that recently in Barkiladi, we noticed that some community had to go and meet their chiefs and tell them to relocate certain people that are seen within their communities, that they're taking over their wives, they're taking over, issues, like certain things, within their vicinity. So that has also created source of conflict within that environment. So climate change is of great destruction, and also has an adverse effect within Plateau State.
Thank you very much, Manji. Unless another speaker wants to add a word on climate change, we can move on to Lawan and Nengak on the breeding and identification and source with cows coming from the Sahel.
Thank you very much, Flo. There has been like a long-held belief around the white breed of cattle in the northern part of the country. They are always associated with the Fulani. People always believe that the Fulanis are the owners of this, majorly the owners of white cattle. And whenever they are found in the market and are not being linked to any Fulani, then the tendency is that maybe they have been stolen. Yeah, but to some extent, yes, the Fulani are known very well to be associated with the white cow because of its meat production quality. However, there are other ethnic groups within the northern part of the country. I'm not sure about Plateau, but to some extent in Kaduna, parts of Kaduna, there are non-Fulani ethnic groups, that are engaged in breeding white cows. So that belief or assertion is not always true. However, what we have seen in places like Zamfara is that communities have imposed bans on their members, preventing them from sort of even purchasing cows to bring back to the communities, because that is like an outright invitation to violence, to attacks by cattle rustlers. That tells you now that whatever the type of breed, if you bring it, it's going to be stolen, and it's going to result in an attack, probably a large-scale attack on the community. Yeah, that's what I want to chip in on this thing.
Okay. Thank you, Lawan. I would just quickly add on that point to say that restricting the sale of any particular breed in the open market might not be a solution to cattle rustling, because we are talking about illicit economies here. They will definitely find other channels to sell it. And if it proves difficult, they will only then concentrate on the breed that is easily acceptable in the market. I mentioned earlier the mixed, it's not only Fulanis that are in the business. When you find cattle in Lagos, it would probably have changed hands 5 times. And so trying to restrict white cattle on the suspicion that it might have been rustled, perhaps it was rustled, but the rustling has been done way back in the value chain. And so it becomes very difficult to restrict at the market. Sorry, one sentence on climate change. I think that a scarcity of resources like water and grazing is going to push herders into very extreme locations. For example, grazing in rocks and isolated places where farmers don't use. And that particularly puts them at risk of cattle rustlers. And also, this is what we are seeing, continuous clashes with farmer community. So there is indeed a severe impact of climate change on cattle herding and also cattle rustling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kingsley. Last words for you.
Thank you, Flo. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I'll just speak briefly on the need to couple securitized approaches with development-oriented strategies, and the why and how. So for the why is because cattle rustling usually leads to, translates into huge humanitarian crisis. Just to give you a sense of the scale, in Zamfara alone, more than 3,587 houses have been destroyed. And within this same period, that's between 2011 and 2019, over 6,483 women have been rendered widowed, and most of them with no source of livelihood. And you have about 25,000 and over 25,000 orphans. Now, this is a huge humanitarian crisis because most of these women and children are uneducated, and they are on the streets and become very vulnerable to becoming to being integrated into jihadist or armed bandit groups. So that's why there's need to be development-oriented approaches that focus on providing livelihoods, alternative livelihoods, improving sanitation, and providing these victims with safer shelters. Otherwise, they become very vulnerable. Now, the how is government needs to invest more than it currently does in development approaches. We know that, for example, the military budget in Nigeria is a heavy chunk, and we are talking about a country that spends billions and billions of naira on securitized approaches. So if a fraction of that budget can be rechanneled to cater for the livelihoods of communities affected by violence associated with cattle rustling, I think it will go a long way. I'll stop here because we're already out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kingsley. And thank you, everyone, for the very interesting question from the audience. And thank you for the key contributions from our speakers today. We ran a bit out of time for the Q&A. So if I think there's a couple of questions that haven't been answered, feel free to reach out to us and we can continue the discussion outside of this webinar. We also encourage you to go on the website of Global Initiative to find several resources, including the report that has been presented today, and as well as other resources like the hotspot mapping tool and report that was mentioned by Kingsley in the beginning of this webinar. Also, if you're interested in cattle rustling, we have soon another report coming out, but this time focusing on Mali. So there is really a lot going on. And if you want to be aware of everything, you can sign up to the newsletter. The link to do that has just been sent in the chat box. So feel free to sign up. And yeah, thank you again to everyone, and have a lovely rest of the day and a great week ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.